Okay, I don't know how I'm going to go explaining this, but I've seen a lot of confusion about it, so I've got to give it a go. What I'm going to explain is different types of pressure. So there are three types of pressure measurement. One is absolute pressure. The second is gauge, G-U-G-E pressure. And the third is differential pressure. Okay, now absolute pressure is the actual pressure, if you like. If you imagine we're sitting on Earth at sea level-ish, then all the air around us is exerting pressure on us. So if we imagine we're holding a box, for example, then air pressure is pushing in on the box all the way around. And that's just the barometric air pressure. Now the box doesn't collapse because there's also air inside the box that's pushing out at the same way. And you can say, well, why doesn't the cardboard get squashed? And the answer is that all the little gaps inside the cardboard are also filled with air at this pressure as well. If you put a complete vacuum inside the box, then it will get squashed. So the absolute pressure is the actual pressure of the air. So if you ask what's the pressure in that box there, it's 1 bar, or 100 kPa-ish. The standard sea level is 101.3 something kPa. Or I think for people in the US or Myanmar or Liberia, it's 14.7 psi, I think. Now, just to be specific, this is 100 kPa absolute. That's the correct name for it. That's absolute pressure. Now, you might say that if I got a pressure gauge and put a hose into this box and looked at it, it would say 0 on it. And that's because the pressure gauge, I'll see if my drawing skills are up to the task here. I don't know how I'm going to do this. I'm just going to draw that's a diaphragm there, so that if you put more pressure in here, that will expand that way. And that pushes on this needle, I guess. So the more pressure's on here, the further the needle goes. And when it's completely not deflected there, then it shows 0. And that's called gauge pressure because the outside here is also open to the atmosphere. So if you've got 1 bar here, or 1 bar absolute here, and 1 bar absolute here, then it's going to show 0 on the pressure gauge. And if you've got 2 bar absolute in here, it's going to show 1 bar on the gauge here. Now, gauge pressure is useful because a lot of things, in a lot of cases, the actual absolute pressure is not that important. And what you really want to know is what is the pressure relative to the outside air. So in a tire, for example, the pressure relative to the outside air is what's important because the outside air is pushing in on it, and so that doesn't get you anything. So when a tire pressure gauge says it's 30 psi, then that means that you've got that's 30 psi G, 30 psi gauge, which means that you've actually got about 45 psi absolute inside here, and then about 15 psi absolute on the outside, and then the gauge will show 30 psi. And often when people talk in pressures, they talk about this because they used to look at things in gauges. But this is, we're doing to be specific that this is a gauge pressure that we're measuring. Differential pressure is the same as gauge pressure, except that gauge pressure, you're always talking about the atmospheric pressure here. Whereas the differential pressure is just the difference between any two pressure points. So an example of differential pressure is a fuel injector. So you've got a fuel rail and you've got your injector there, and that's spraying into your inlet manifold. or spraying it into your foot, whatever, it doesn't matter. So let's say you're at one bar of boost, which means what's the pressure? It's 2 bar absolute. And a fuel rail is at, let's say that's at 4 bar gauge. So if you put a fuel pressure gauge on it, you would say 4 bar or 58 psi, which is actually 5 bar absolute. And then your differential pressure is 3 bar differential, or 45 psi D, 43.5, you know, the actual details don't matter that much. So, a few points of confusion that people seem to have. MAP is absolute pressure. That's what the A stands for. Because if you're inside the engine and you're trying to work out how much fuel it needs, that's based on the actual pressure of the air inside the engine. That tells you what the volume of the air is. The volume and the pressure tells you how much pressure, volume, gives you the amount of air molecules that you have. It doesn't matter what the pressure is outside the engine. Once you know the pressure inside the engine, that tells you what the mass of air is. So this is the ideal gas equation, Boyle's law. When we talk about pressure there, that's absolute pressure. So that's why MAP is always absolute pressure. People can express it as a gauge pressure, except that's really MGP, gauge pressure. So when people talk about boost, that's actually gauge pressure. So I've got 1 bar of boost. That means you've actually got 1 bar above atmosphere. So that's gauge pressure. People sometimes express MAP as a fake gauge pressure, which I understand if people used to looking at pressure gauges, but I think it's a way to make things more complicated than they have to be. But yeah, so that's that. Fuel pressure, oil pressure, things like that are normally expressed as gauge pressure. Because you would verify them by looking at them with a pressure gauge. And with oil pressure, for example, it's important because the oil is pushing against the other side, which is normally unpressurized. So it's atmospheric pressure. And same with fuel pressure, even though we care about the differential fuel pressure across the injector, when we're trying to size a fuel pump and work out what our fuel lines need to be rated at and that sort of thing, then that's a gauge pressure that we really care about. And the other thing is that we can test the differential fuel pressure by disconnecting the manifold vacuum reference on the fuel pressure regulator, which then becomes a gauge pressure then because it's measuring relative to atmospheric. So I'm not sure if that clears it up at all, but hopefully it provides something.